G'day everyone. Thought I'd talk to you today about what gear do you need for setting up or to enter the wedding photography business. Now I'm going to be talking this from the real basics, so if you do know much about gear and everything else, you probably may not want to watch this video. This is going to be a real basics type introduction to what you would need to use to join the wedding photography world that I'm actually in. I'm not going to talk about like I use Sony, but I'm not just going to talk about it from that aspect. I'm going to leave it open to buying anything because that really is more relevant to what's going on in the industry. So I thought I'd talk to you about it from that point of view. The gear that I show you, though, will only be Sony, obviously, because that's all I use. But I thought we could start by just talking about what camera bands and things like that you actually use. If you do want to, you can check out a whole wedding series that I'm actually put on recently that takes you through the whole wedding, and it shows you how to pose the bride and bridesmaids, how you introduce yourself, how you shoot the wedding dress, how you do the makeup, the ceremony and everything else. I've put 4 videos up at this stage, but you might also find those really interesting as well. So let's start by looking at what brands you actually need or what there are out there to shoot wedding photography. So basically, I'm just going to talk about brands. Now, you have to excuse my writing because I'm a terrible writer, but you'll get the message anyway. So, look, there's a few brands out there. Now, I'll put Sony on first because that's obviously what I shoot with, but there's also Canon. All right, there's also Fuji, and there's also Nikon. So let's have a look now. I'm not going to talk about the high-end models of these because we're talking about you coming in from an entry area of cameras. So I'm going to talk to you about that, and I'll explain what the differences are between some of these cameras a little bit later. But let's have a look. So say, for instance, the Sony there, you might want to look at something like the A6300 or the A6500. There's the Canon. You could say have the 6D. Now there's a Mark II version as well. Fuji, you could have something like the XT2. There's also an XT3. That's the latest version. This one here is the A6500 is the latest one. And I think there's a Mark II of the 6D. Nikon, obviously you could have something like a D7200 or something like that. So these are cameras that you can actually buy. I mean, look, like I said, there's millions of different variances of these, and I'm not going to tell you which one you should buy, but I will talk about what the differences are shortly between these two. But if you're starting, really, the thing is that when you're dealing with these camera systems, it's far better to probably purchase something that your friends already have because you're going to find it a lot easier to get other gear that I'll talk about later on. But if you get something that your friends have got, well, then it's easy to ask them for help and things like that. So that you might find that much easier if you're with a system of people that are shooting the same thing that you're actually shooting. But they're the main brands that are actually out there. If you're looking at it, which is Sony, Canon, Fuji, and Nikon. There is obviously also Olympus, Pentax. There's stacks of different ones out there. Panasonic. There's heaps and heaps of them out there that you could actually look at to actually buy. Now, there's also something else that you have to consider, which is full frame and APS-C cameras. So there's full frame, and there's also APS-C. All right, so there's 2 different camera types that are out there. It's just the sensor size. I'll just draw this as a quick thing so you can just see. If you had full frame, it might give you a size like this. APS-C may give you a size that's sort of like this, just as a rough guide. So that's basically what happens. Full frame gives a different look than what APS-C does. I personally prefer full frame. But full frame cameras and lenses are much more expensive than what APS-C lenses are. And that's something that you have to consider when you're starting out. And it's something that may be determined by how much you've got to spend. But either way, you're going to get great results whether you're using a full frame camera or whether you're using an APS-C type camera. Full frame cameras obviously are things like the Sony. You've also got, and that could be say the A7 III. You've also got Canon. And you might have something like the 5D Mark IV. And then you've got Nikon. And you've got, in Nikon, you've actually got the let's just put the D850 up there. in Nikon. Now, they're not mirrorless. This one's mirrorless. Canon have just released a mirrorless camera out at the moment, and Nikon have also just released a camera out at the moment, which is also mirrorless. I just don't recommend them at this stage. That's why I'm not putting them down, because they don't have something. Let me just clear this for a second. They don't have something that is this, which is dual card slots. So let me explain what that actually means. So it's dual card slots. Now, on the actual camera itself, I'm just going to switch over to here so I can show you. On these cameras themselves, so what these will have is it has inside here that I've got dual card slots. Now, that is really important if you're shooting something that cannot be reshot, because if one of these cards fails, and they do fail, you've got a card, if you're doing a wedding and say, for instance, you can never replace that shot. This is where I think some are going to disagree with me, I know, but if a card fails and then you've lost that wedding, how are you going to explain to that bride that you've lost her wedding and that you can't give her images? She's never going to see that first kiss again. She's never going to see those other parts. That it's a one-off day that hopefully is never repeated. So at least in this scenario, I've got backup. So I'm shooting to this card and also this card at the same time. So that's really important. So what I'm suggesting to you is to buy cameras that have got dual card slots in them, due to the fact that it does give you that backup that's actually there, and that's something you're going to have to consider. Now, I'm not going to list all of those right away, but because we'd be sitting here for hours. But when you're looking at specifications on cameras that you're going to buy, I would suggest that you look at the specs and buy something that has a dual card slot, due to the fact that you have got that redundancy there if you need it. And that's something that's really important. The next thing that I wanted to talk to you about was lenses, because this is also obviously important. Now, what lenses do you need to do a wedding? Now, I can tell you that I mostly have recently shoot primes, and the two lenses that I could almost shoot any wedding is with a 35mm and also an 85mm. Now, the 35, I'll say, is ranging. There's also something called an f-stop. Now, an f-stop, like here, might be f2.8. All right, and this one might be an f1.8. The lower that this number goes is what they call the faster the glass is. So if this was a 85 1.4, it means it can let more light into the lens. So as a minimum, I'm suggesting that you get 2.8 lenses, and faster if you can actually afford it. Now, they're two lenses that I could say you could start with, which is the 35, and I'll just show you a couple of these just so you can have a look at what these look like in my regards. Now, this is just a little 35 f2.8 that I use, and there's millions of different lenses out there that you can actually use. This one is the 85mm lens. These are what they call prime lenses. So there's two lenses that we're dealing with here. There's prime lenses, and there's also zoom lenses. All right, and they both work differently. Zoom means that it's got multiple focal lengths in that lens. Like it might have, for instance, and it looks like this. This is a 28 to 35. So this is a 28 to 75mm lens. If you look at it, you can see down here that it will say 28 to 75, and it's an f2.8 lens. So this means that the aperture is the same all the way through. And that's a great feature about that lens. So prime lenses are only one focal length. These are primes up here. Both of these are primes because they're stuck at 35 and 85mm. A zoom lens can be something like a 28 to 75mm. And that's a very important thing to remember. The other thing, like I said to you, that when you're buying these zoom lenses, there's two zoom lenses that you can actually buy. Let me just delete these so I can put this down. There's what they call variable in aperture. Now, what that means is it might be, say, I'll just put a 70 to 200, all right, millimeter lens. You might have one that goes from, say, 4.5 to 6.5. All right, and that means that as you zoom in, if you're down at the 70mm end, you'll get 4.5 in the aperture. If you go up to the 200mm, you might get a 6.5 aperture. They're never as good as, say, getting a 70 to 200mm f2.8. What that means is no matter how much you zoom through this range, you'll always get a 2.8 aperture. So that's really important as well. I would always recommend to try and get lenses that have this fixed aperture rather than a variable aperture, because you'll get a much better quality lens. Most of the time when you're buying lenses, if you get kit lenses like this, these will be more the kit lens. They'll always be variable. You're better off to not get the variable lenses, to just buy the body only, and then buy something like this constant aperture lens. I hope that makes sense. It's a bit much for, I suppose, beginners to actually understand, but it's very important that you do try and get fixed, what they call fixed focal length lenses. Now, another thing too, what about brands of these lenses? So if I just delete this, if you're dealing with brands, all right, now there's lots, I'm not going to list all of them, but there's basically, if you had, say, well, let's talk about Sony, but it'll be the same if it was Canon and other brands, all right? So say, for instance, you were buying a Sony camera. Well, yes, now there's also Sony lenses. All right, there's Sony lenses, but you can also fit on there. There's Tamron. There's also Sigma. There's Samyang. You can also put Canon on there. You can even stick Nikon on there. Like there's stacks of stuff that you can actually put onto these. I'll better put it up there because you can't see it. You can stick Nikon on there as well. Now, this is one of the beauties particularly of going for a system like Sony, or if you went for some other brands will let you put adapted lenses on there as well. Like, for instance, just let me come off here. If you had, say, for instance, you wanted to, say, have a Sony camera and then you wanted to put a Canon lens on there, what you've got to do with that is on the actual, this is the lens itself, you buy an adapter which fits in between. So it's an adapter. All right, you buy an adapter that fits in between here, and that then connects onto your camera. And then you can use a Canon lens on a Sony actual camera. Now, it never works as well, though, as if you buy what they call native lenses. Now, a native lens means that it's actually manufactured to fit on that camera without an adapter. So you're always better off to buy a native lens to start off with. But it's a great way that you can run other lenses if you have these systems. But you've just got to understand that you don't have to buy Sony lenses if you buy a Sony camera. If you buy a Canon, you don't have to buy Canon lenses. You can buy Sigma and other lenses. The same if you buy Nikon, you can buy Nikon lenses. You can buy, say, Sigma lenses to go onto the Nikon mount. So you are very lucky in that respect. And it's a great feature that you can actually use to put other lenses on that are much cheaper than buying, say, the native lenses, because obviously Tamron lenses are going to be cheaper than, say, buying a Canon lens and a Canon lens for a Canon camera. So that's something that you do have to think about as well if you're going down that line as well. So, but what I'm suggesting to you is that it is better if you buy what they call that native lens, though, so it does have the native mount rather than having to buy that adapter to fit on it. Most people that buy the adapters are doing that because they already have the lens and they've changed systems. Like they might have been a Canon user and they've changed to Sony, so they'll actually buy an adapter so they can use that lens to put onto the Sony camera, and therefore it'll still work. So that's something that you can consider as well. So I wouldn't be too worried, though, like I said, about what you want to choose for your camera system. I'd probably be more thinking about what do your friends use, because it relates directly to what I'm talking about in the next stage, which is this, which is backup. Okay, so what I'm talking about here is that you need backup. All right, now the reason why I'm talking about this, and it's so important, like the dual card slot that I mentioned before, the thing with backup is that you've got something in case if something fails. Now, it's really important that you have a backup system in place. Now, what I mean by that is you've got a replacement for every single bit of gear that you've got. And I'll talk about extras that you need shortly. But you need, say, for instance, if you have a camera that is your only camera and that fails, you can't do your job. And that would be your worst nightmare, because trust me, I've dropped cameras and I've had things fail before, and then I've always had a backup that at least I can grab that backup and shoot. And it might be that even if you were desperate, that you could use something pretty small if you did have that and your funds were really tight. But this is why I was saying that it's better if you're in the system with some friends, so that if you've got the same system as them, it might be that you can borrow one of their backup bodies to use at the time, or you could use one of their lenses as well and just use that, or you could even hire one as an extra. You just shouldn't go into a wedding with one body and one lens, because if something does happen, you're in big trouble. And that's why I'm saying it's very, very important to have that backup strategy there as well. And that's where I'm saying, like, if you have a system where you've got the same camera, you can ask your friends for a second body and just lend that, or you can hire one. And then you already know how it works because you're using the same system. So that's something that you've got to consider when you're dealing with that type of thing. And that's why I'm saying it might be important to move into a system that's the same as others. And that's really important as well. So that's why I'm saying always consider backup. And not many people will tell you that, but you really should consider that. And you need backup of your lenses and cameras particularly, and even your flashes, which I'm going to talk about in a minute for your extras. Let's sort of talk about what else you need. All right, so the main thing that you actually need as extras is flash. All right, you need some sort of a flash system, and I'd say you're probably better off with a speed light. Now, what I mean by that is something like this. So if we're talking about speed lights themselves, I mean, you can't really go past Godox, because Godox is a really cheap system, and you can go in nice and cheaply at the end. I'm not going to talk to you about all the features inside this. I've talked about Godox flashes before. If you go down, you should be able to find where I've talked about that. But you can sort of see how nice and small this is. So you definitely need to have, say, a nice small strobe that you can use, or speed light that you can use. And you can buy multiple ones of these, and then you can run them sort of one off another, and you can have them in multiple parts of the rooms and things like that. So that's a great way of doing it. So that's an important thing as well. And I'd suggest looking at something like Godox. I'm using the Sony strobes, obviously because I'm in the Sony system, but I could have bought Godox. These are way more expensive, though, than what you'd have for something like Godox. You could probably buy 3 of those for one of these. So the Godox is a much cheaper system of actually how to get into that marketplace. That's a really important thing. And again, have a backup. You need multiple flashes. At least have an extra one in case if one fails and you're doing things like a wedding reception where you can't repeat that, and then if it's very dark in that wedding reception, well, you're not going to be any use to anyone if you can't use a flash at all, or you can't do any photography during that nighttime shots that you're actually dealing with. So you've got to think of things like that. You need multiple batteries. All right, so you need multiple batteries. I always take more than what I need, because you never know how many you're going to use, or sometimes batteries just fail. So always make sure that you've got enough. You can also take a charger and have that charging or something while you're working during the day if you want to. That's also an important thing as well. But I also like to, like I said, I'll always have a lot more batteries than what I actually need for the day, just to cover myself. There's other things as well, and this is not really on the photography side, but just make sure that your bride does sign a contract. All right, make sure they are signing a contract, because it's so important if something goes wrong that you're covered by that. If you're talking about this, all right, you should cover things like everything involved. All right, everything you're going to cover. All right, like how many, as a guide, how many prints, or not prints, but how many digital files. And I give a range of digital files that I cover in there. So I'll say something between 800 to 1,000 or something like that. I'll list in there. Time involved. Time that you're going to be at the wedding. So list the hours that you're actually covering yourself for there. And that's a really important thing. If you need meals, That's something I always cover in my contract. Parking tickets or parking costs, I cover that in my contract. These are all things that I put down inside of these wedding contracts. I try and cover everything there. You know, your timeline, that how long is it going to take for them to get their images. The thing you do this for is because you want to cover yourself in case if the bride comes back at you then and says you haven't met her needs or you haven't covered everything that you've done. And I always make sure that we both sign. We both sign that contract, and therefore there's you both know what you're getting. You know what you're meant to be supplying, and they know what they're supplying as well. And these are really sort of interesting things that you actually put down. Well, it's not interesting. I mean, it's a necessity. I would never ever do a wedding without having a contract in place, due to the fact that it covers me in case if I've been wrong. I have had brides before that have said, David, you didn't give me this. And I've said, read the contract, that wasn't included, and it saved me because it wasn't included in the contract. And it's something you really have to make sure that you actually do. Eventually, I'll show you how my whole system of that works, and I still want to get back to that at some stage. Now, this is a really brief overview about what you need to get in, like talking about what your minimum lenses were, talking about that I could get by with just having that 35 and the 85. But remember, there's other things in play as well, that when you're dealing with these lenses, you also have to think about, let me just delete this for a minute. You also have to think about if you need to shoot wider than what you've got. Like I said, if I said that it was the 35 millimeter and the 85. Another good lens you could put inside there is the 50 millimeter. But remember too, you may want to go wider than that. You may need something like a 16 if you're going to do a really big group shot. But if you know beforehand that you've got enough room to move back and forwards, that you'll know that you've got enough room to use, say, a 35 to get a whole group in. The bride may want, say, for instance, a whole crowd shot of who's attended their wedding. And I probably would say it's a great idea to get something like what I've got there, which is that 28 to 75 millimeter. That gives you that focal range that's sort of wide, going to a longer focal length, and I don't have to keep changing lenses. I also often use the 16 to 35 mil as well. That will give me my wide angle if I need a wide angle. But I'm talking about if you're really struggling for funds, that you may want to just start out with the 35 mil and the 50 mil and the 85 mil, I should say. That would get you by as a whole. Like that. So anyway, let me know what you think. Please watch the other videos though. Like I said, I've posted 4 videos now showing you how to shoot a real wedding, and it is a real wedding. I just did that recently, and I'm going to post more videos of that soon. Apart from that, let me know in the comments down below if you have any questions, and I'll see you all again soon for the next video. Bye for now.